Margherita Hack, a polite response to her harsh attack on astrology many, many years ago. At 22 in 1970, I fulfilled my military service with the Hawk missile group in Latina, thus learning the meaning of the mysterious, to me, English term, bird of prey. Later, when I read for the first time in the pages of Repubblica the surname of the director of the Trieste Astronomical Observatory, a discordant contrast to the first, I didn't notice the C key instead of the W and failed to note that this was Hack. Therefore, I owe the subject an apology. I had associated the two. In reality, Hack, as I later discovered by consulting the dictionary, is far removed from the first meaning and should instead be translated as scribbler, mercenary writer. However, I don't intend to bore you further with the etymological slips I made, nor with the fact that this name is so far removed from the exquisite veracity of the very Tuscan Margherita Hack. The purpose of this article is different: to discuss the paper that the aforementioned professor published in issue 88 of I problemi di Ulisse, the monographic journal published by Sansoni and edited by Maria Luisa Astaldi. The article, which unfolds over 8 dense pages, seeks to demonstrate, as the title suggests, the scientific inconsistency of astrology, and is part of the first official collection of proceedings of the committee founded by Piero Angela in 1978 to demonstrate the groundlessness of parapsychology, astrology, etc. And I must confess that I began reading the monograph entitled Science and Mystery with some apprehension, anticipating a very high level of cultural and scientific content, precisely what one might expect from the work of 21 select minds. I read Margherita Hack's article, then reread it and read it again. Something must have escaped me, because both in relation to the title and the repeatedly stated intentions of the members of the aforementioned special tribunal, I would have expected to consult a scientific text, one that's starting from a method and advancing along the lines of a defined epistemological vision of the problem, would arrive at a scientific demonstration of the inconsistency of astrology. I was therefore preparing to examine diagrams to learn about tests performed or specific attacks on what, for better or worse, astrologers have done, especially in recent years. Or I would have thought to find a dissertation based on the philosophy of science on the inconsistency of astrology in a Galilean or Popperian vein. Instead, Popper is cited only in passing. Astrology is rejected because, unlike science, it is vague in its answers and cannot be falsified, and without any proof of the content of the quotation itself. I must say, however, that the piece, from a literary perspective, is well written, and demonstrates the author's commitment, who must have spent at least an entire afternoon composing it. In my opinion, it is a literary, not a scientific piece of writing, pleasantly entertaining, and one that could be enjoyed while sipping tea with high society ladies. It's not lacking in humor, its style is fluid, it demonstrates the author's high culture, it's journalistically well crafted, and it's rich in quotations, but it lacks one important thing: a scientific structure. I could be wrong, but let others judge. Therefore, the title is The Scientific Inconsistency of Astrology, and to demonstrate this inconsistency, Margherita Hack proposes the following arguments. 1. A brief history of astrology written in a personal key. 2. A comparison between astrology and the Marquise d'Urfé, who was the most seductive breast in France 40 years earlier. 3. How is it that of 3 children born at the same time and place, with the same signs in the same houses, and in short, with the same horoscope, one becomes a poet, another a merchant, and the third a tramp? 4. The thesis of a certain Franco Sisi, a Florentine from centuries past, who argued that there are no more than 7 planets in our solar system, since there are only 7 windows in the human head: nostrils, ears, eyes, and mouth. 5. Astrologers don't even agree on the very definition of astrology, and follow different methods and schools. 6. The impossibility of superimposing signs and constellations in relation to the precession of the equinoxes, which never ceases to confuse astrologers. 7. The cultural inadequacy of astrologers, which, according to Professor Hack, is striking when reading a text she herself, she must dream about it even at night, has been attacking for years. 8. Parallels between astrologers and tragopans and dandelions, plants floating in the air that can be destroyed with a breath. 9. The attitude of astrologers who slink away into the mossy meanders of symbolism, or the pissing depths of psychoanalysis, bringing up the ever-present Jung and pretending to understand the meaning of his mysterious synchronicities. 10. Astrology, behind its apparently technical terms borrowed from astronomy, actually masks the childhood dreams of animistic and mythological nature and a defense against ancestral fears. 11. The defeat of astrology by astronomy. 12. Astrology, which is made of nothing like a comet, ended in disaster, from the Greek dis-aster, the bad star. So these are the arguments that would demonstrate the scientific inconsistency of astrology. I'd like to say, come on, madam, let's be serious. Ye component placement, but when I can, I'm against simplification, so I'll try to answer in detail. Hack's use of history, and in particular the history of astrology, raises the question of the subject's expertise in the matter, and whether the texts of Bohl, Garin, and Puckert, universally recognized as classics, are no longer valid from a historical epistemological perspective. I'm no expert on breasts, and since I can't ask Fellini for advice, I'll ask Hack, what do breasts have to do with the scientific inconsistency of astrology? As for the 3 children with the same horoscope, one becoming a poet, another a tramp, and the other a businessman, I have to say I don't believe it. However, the author hasn't provided evidence, as one would expect when attempting to proceed scientifically. However, evidence has been provided. See Vernon Clark's Experiments, Jacques Sadoul, The Enigma of the Zodiac, Palazzi Publishers, that astrologers are able to recognize, simply by observing the birth charts, the different professions of subjects they examine, even distinguishing a prostitute from a librarian, born just 5 hours apart. What about the Florentine Francesco Sisi and the 7 windows, or gaps, in his head? There are black sheep in every family, and let's hope our persistent enemy doesn't want to do us the wrong, as Barbeau says, by confusing bad astrologers with astrology. On the other hand, it wouldn't be too difficult for us to name the many differently intelligent astronomers of the past and who have vomited up clams like sissies without thereby invalidating astronomy. What should we deduce? That medicine is for the gullible? And aren't there perhaps different schools on the topics of black holes and the birth of the universe? And here we come to the crux of the matter, the precession of the equinoxes, which according to the subject never ceases to confuse astrologers. But here, if there is confusion, it's only on the part of astronomers. For centuries and centuries, we've continued to declare that the space of our competence is that relating to the signs and not the constellations, and if astronomers continue to turn a deaf ear on this point, it's not our fault. As for the cultural inadequacy of astrologers, well, there's much to be said. Excluding the author, for reasons of good taste, and not choosing champions among the shamans, I allow myself to doubt that our culture is superior to that of a Barbol, a Rudyard, or many of my respected national and international colleagues. Unless the subject specifically refers to astronomical culture. In this case, however, we could rightly speak of astronomers' cultural inadequacy in matters of astrology. Regarding tragopans and dandelions, aside from noting astronomer Hack's unexpected botanical knowledge, we must note that as with breasts, we don't see the connection, and even if there were, it wouldn't be a scientific argument. Step 9 is a masterpiece, a piece apart. Thus, we learn that astrologers are accustomed to slipping into the mossy meanders of symbolism. What does Margherita Hack intend to establish? A supposed qualitative primacy of scientific culture over symbolic analogical culture? Is one law of Kepler worth two poetic comparisons of Shakespeare? Symbolism is symbolism, and that's it, without further adjectives. On this subject, the author should read Francesco May's highly erudite contribution, strangely published a few pages further down hers. From the mossy depths of symbology, we move to the piss-ridden depths of psychology, and here we were forced to draw a line and consult Devoto and Ollie. Piss-ridden, smeared with piss. We searched in vain for other possible explanations. That's precisely what the subject meant. A note of nostalgia, we confess, gripped us, and we thought of Freud, Jung, Adler, Ellenberger, Fromm, Musatti, and countless others, and of the decades of their studies that ended miserably in piss. Certainly these men, especially the former, had to push the current thinking to impose their new ideas, and more than once they encountered open hostility from those who disagreed with them. But in these latitudes, we believe they had never landed. Margherita, excuse my familiarity, but your blunt jargon invites me to take some liberties, albeit entirely respectful ones. Then says that astrologers bring in the ever-present Jung, pretending to understand the meaning of his mysterious synchronicities. Why pretending to understand? Are astrologers so handicapped as to be unable to grasp what you can understand? And why does she say mysterious synchronicities? Jung's synchronicity is mysterious until studied, and in any case it doesn't seem to me that Hack is particularly qualified to pronounce on matters of psychology. At point 10, in my opinion, the author makes two clear errors. First, astrology does not borrow terms from astronomy, but rather the opposite, since the two disciplines were born chronologically in order. Second, by making an improvised sociological analysis of the topic of astrology, she exposes herself to criticism of being a dilettante in a field that is not her own. The next topic is the defeat of astrology by astronomy. It's hard to see why we should speak of defeat in a discussion that aims to be, according to the speaker's stated intentions, scientific. And then there's a clear contradiction. Further on in the cited text, on page 93, it states that astrology is booming, that it has 30 million believers in the United States, and that it is the most widespread religion worldwide. It's not true, however, that it's the less educated classes who benefit from it, as evidenced by the statistics we can produce. The same applies to point 12, which speaks of astrology's disaster, and where our discussion concludes with the poetic image of a comet made of nothing. As mentioned above, the discussion of Popper would have deserved more space. Therefore, according to Margherita Hack, astrology is not scientific, just like psychoanalysis. But then what about the statistics of Gauquelin and Chouinard, and our own, if I may, as well as those of Adé and Vernon Clark's experiments? Why hasn't this been discussed? The scientific inconsistency of astrology can only be demonstrated on this level, never on the level of witticisms. But our visceral enemies, as physicist Marcello Cini calls them in Il Manifesto, avoid such arguments, or if they do touch on them, it's to falsify them, not in the Popperian sense, but in that of omissions and intentional misrepresentations. See Ugo Volli's book on this subject. Comparing the article in question with Hack's previous visceral attacks, which seem directed more at astrologers than at astrology itself, and which are light years away from Alessandro Bausani's serene and appreciable article in Scienza e Mistero, it's hard to see where the original and hopefully constructive contribution lies, something one would expect to find years later in the thinking of someone who has consistently chosen to fight astrology the way others fight syphilis or world hunger. One final consideration. I haven't said, and I won't say, that I intend to avoid controversy. That too is necessary, especially when it arises as a response. For example, I can't help but be polemical when Margherita Hack, in the essay cited above, says that astronomers who have abandoned astrology have gained in dignity. Dear Margherita Hack, the respect I generally have for those older than me, stemming from my belief in their greater maturity, does not prevent me from asking you, on this occasion, to extend your hand and accept a reprimand from me, who could be your son. Dignity, you should know, is not acquired with academic titles, much less by entrenching oneself beyond the citadel of official science. Dignity, dear Professor, without wishing to be rhetorical, is as much a farmer sowing under the full moon as an Australian aborigine. So in the future, when you continue to speak ill of us, remember that we are listening, and while we can smile at the breasts of the Marquise d'Urfey, we will not be able to do the same when you continue to slide from the rigorous level of doctrinal polemics to the moody level of attempting to morally lynch people. Ciro Discepolo. Note: I was hesitant to decide whether or not to republish this piece of mine today, in 2025, after hearing from a highly credible source that a canonization process is underway for the professor who passed away many years ago. And also because I know full well that in this country, homeland of saints, poets, and navigators, it is almost considered sacrilegious to express any dissent or criticism regarding deceased persons. However, precisely on this point, I would like to invite my fellow citizens to look at this more objectively, considering that when criticism is polite and not aggressive, when it attempts to respond with arguments and does not wish to end up in the piss, it should still be considered a healthy expression of dialectics and pluralism of thought.